Good evening, listeners, to this crime scene podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Perez, accompanied by Braulio Valdivia and Gabriel Nieto. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the exoneration case of Rolando Cruz. My apologies. To the basics of this case, a young 10-year-old girl back in July 7th, who was born in July 7th, 1972. So you can already tell this case would be gonna be a dated one. So you can assume that DNA was probably not in his prime at the time, which is very important to keep in mind considering the following. On February 25th, 1983, 10-year-old Janine Nicaragua, excuse me if I pronounced the first name wrong, was apparently sick from the flu. She stood home, and back then it would be a little normal for the mom to leave home, probably to work or whatever she had to do that day. She left Janine home alone, and apparently that day she then goes missing. Prior Hours prior to her going missing though, her mom stopped by and fed her lunch. Around that time would be noon to 2 o'clock maybe. And yeah, so she goes back to work. Janine is left back home and she is fed recently. And here's where things start to get a little violent. Um, no one can find her after that. Once the mom gets home, uh, eh, she can't find her anywhere. She's missing. So after conducting search parties and what have you, 2 days later, she was found how far away? 6 miles from her home, I'd say in a forest preserve. She was found raped and beaten to death. And the only apparent evidence from the crime scene appeared to be a boot print from on the front door, and the door appeared to be beaten off the hinges, just obliterated to get past. Fast forward to um this case reaching the paper, and there was a reward for $5,000 to provide any help to the case. But then it doubles up to 10,000 because no one could find anything. And so a well-known gang member from Aurora approached the police in hopes to maybe get his hands on this reward. Uh, this is Rolando Cruz. He gives them information, and suddenly the fingers pointed at him, and no attempt to get any DNA evidence, not really rational at the time. They just pointed the finger at him because he's the only one to bring up any information because they have none already. And he just fabricates so many things about the case while he's being, I wouldn't say interrogated, but questioned. He's just fabricating so many different things, and he's almost digging himself a grave just because he wanted to get a little piece of the pie. But without further ado, this is Braulio's take on further investigation and more information about the entire case involving Ronaldo. Rolando. This is a really weird case. It bounces around and it's it almost seems like what's happening isn't true or is like not allowed to. A lot of information is just disregarded just because they want to get a closed case. And yeah, a lot of not corners were crossed, just foul play. Uh, but yeah, this is Brelio's take on it, and enjoy.
Okay, so the contributing causes of conviction in the case of Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez were jailhouse informants and false confessions. Basically, Cruz's defense attorneys believed that the jailhouse informants and others were testifying against him and giving false confessions only for reduced sentences or reward money. Um, and so at this point, Cruz and Hernandez had lost twice in their trials. Like they had two separate trials and they lost both times, and they were sentenced to death both times. But then, in July of 1994, because of public pressure that was growing, the Illinois Supreme Court decided to overturn the conviction, which led to a third trial. Then, in January 1995, Scott Toro, who was Alejandro Hernandez's defense attorney, convinced an Illinois appellate court to overturn the conviction. The third trial of Rolando Cruz began on October 24th, 1995. He even had some of Chicago's finest lawyers lining up to defend him for free. Because I guess, they believed as well that he was an innocent man. The defense attorney of Rolando Cruz for the third case had requested to have Judge Ronald Mailing rule on the case. And by the time of this third trial, there had been very big steps in advancements of DNA, where the forensics expert that had been testing the DNA found in Janine had found out that there was only a 3 in 10,000 chance that the DNA found came from somebody other than Dugan. So Dugan is Brian Dugan. He had actually confessed to killing Janine 3 months after the first trial where they were sentenced to death row, Cruz and Hernandez. Dugan had actually confessed, but for whatever reason, it was not followed up on, and but now it was, and the DNA testing showed that Dugan was definitely there. Then, because of that, the prosecutors had a hard time of trying to convince the jury how Cruz was involved in the murder. And detectives Dennis Kurzawa and Thomas Vosberg claimed to have called another sheriff, Montesano, at his home on the day of the dream statement. The dream statement basically is what those detectives told the jury in the first trial, that Cruz had given them a dream statement about the details of the case that only the police would have known. But now, on November 3rd of 1995, the same officers were called to, or at least Montesano was called to revise his testimony. And he said he had looked through his credit card statements and had found out that he wasn't actually in Illinois the day the other two detectives said that they had called him for advice. He'd been in Florida, so they never actually called him, meaning that the dream statement was a lie by those two detectives, Dennis Kurzawa and Thomas Vosberg. Because of this, the defense attorneys immediately requested the judge to throw out the case for a lack of evidence, and the judge only took a 30-minute recess to consider. He said he couldn't recall a case which more witnesses had changed their testimony, and found Rolando Cruz not guilty on November 3rd, 1995. Then, on December 8th, 1995, the DuPage County State's Attorney Office, they dropped all charges against Alejandro Hernandez. The sheriff officers, Dennis Kurzawa, Thomas Vosberg, and James Montesano, as well as Thomas Knight, Patrick King Jr., and Robert Calander, were all indicted on charges that they had tried to lie and conceal evidence to convict Rolando Cruz, and they went on trial in spring of 1999 for conspiring to frame against Cruz. In June of 1999, they were all acquitted of all charges of misconduct, And in December of 2002, Governor George Ryan granted Cruz a full pardon. Cruz, Hernandez, and Buckley civil suits were all settled for a total of $3.5 million in compensation. And in 2005, Dugan was finally charged with the crime. In 2009, Dugan pled guilty and was sentenced to death, but in 2011, the death penalty was abolished, and Dugan instead got a life sentence without the chance of parole.
Today's episode was brought to you by Prime Energy Drinks. Here's a word from our sponsor.
Hola señoras y señores, por el último día compren su Prime Energy Drink por el precio bajo de $2.49, compren todo el paquete, compren uno, compren dos, compren a toda la compañía. Este especial nomás dura hoy y mañana, cómprelo antes que se acabe.
Here's Gabe Nieto and a process of DNA evidence taken by examiners and investigators of this case. Take it away, Gabe.
In 1992, after further DNA testing, biological material was found on the victim. This DNA eventually established the truth that Dugan had committed the rape and murder of Janine. After a jury hearing, Dugan eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to death in 2009. In the Rolando Cruz case, DNA evidence showed that there was only a 0.003 of 1% chance, a 3 in 10,000 chance that the evidence found in the victim had come from another person other than Brian Dugan. This DNA evidence made a damning case against Dugan and provided that Rolando Cruz was innocent in this case. In this case, investigators used STR DNA testing. STR finds a unique strand in DNA sample that scientists can use to identify differences in people's DNA. In this case, the STR testing found that DNA evidence located at the crime scene and on the victim could only belong to Brian Dugan and not Rolando Cruz or Alejandro Hernandez, proving both of their innocence.
Extremely well said by Gabe Nieto. Personally, I think DNA is individualized so much, it just creates an outstanding case in almost every circumstance. Yeah, it's very easy for someone to be exonerated by good DNA evidence that suggests that they were not, in fact, guilty. There's almost no DNA pointing towards Rolando Cruz, and if that were to ever be considered during investigation, he could have been in jail for a lot less than 12 years, and he deserves all the compensation he can get. And yeah, it was an unfortunate investigation that I guess he was just swept into. But that concludes our podcast for tonight, and I hope you enjoyed. Have a great rest of your night.